continuing the thought that was interrupted by the end of the previous tape, Harrison Ford sees the boyfriend, who was his chief competition, coming to visit Kelly McGillis, and when he sees the boyfriend coming, he stops the car for a moment, considers, and then moves on, going back into his world and knowing that the boyfriend will come up to Kelly and the two of them will get married. This is important, the left-minded perspective of the film, to show that there has been a conclusion, not just the change in her direction of her attitude, that now she knows she's going to stay there, but the proof that the potential for her leaving has been removed. Harrison Ford is not going to swoop in like a white knight and carry her away. So we have, for the right-minded, shown that she has now decided she will stay. That's the direction of her thinking, not that she's trying to find a way to leave, but also that the potential to leave has now been removed. You want dates on these things as we do?
Sure.
Date.
Stamp. 10/29/91.
10/29/91 and a half. Okay.
10:15 in the morning.
This is all for posterior. Anyway. Okay, so getting back to our set of 8 characters that we enumerated before: the protagonist, antagonist, contagonist, guardian, skeptic, sidekick, emotional, and intellectual. We're going to explore each one of these just a little bit. As we mentioned before, they each contain 2 elements in simple stories, one of an internal nature and one of an external nature. And we'll look at that and then divide all of these characters into those 16 characteristics so we get a better idea of the functionality here. In terms of the protagonist, the typical protagonist is made up of the quality of pursuit and the quality of non-consideration. And the protagonist, therefore, is one who is not looking at his internal problem that he has, not exploring it. He has a very fixed mindset, and instead he is intent on pursuing some goal.
That's a left-minded protagonist.
Yes.
And the right-minded would be consideration and avoidance.
Right. Again, we'll go through first on the left-minded, since that is probably the greatest percentage of films are made in the left-minded simple format out of the plurality of different types there are. It's certainly not half of them are anywhere near that, but if we divide them into groups, that's probably the most common grouping that we'll find. So here you have a film that is basically going to have a fixed mindset and a floating physical set, and the characters, therefore, will each represent aspects of the mind that do not change, and they will carry that mental attitude all the way through. Those mental attitudes, in this case, he will be the pursuing, non-considering character, will be the protagonist, and he'll just keep going after that goal and keep going after that goal because he is pursued and remains pursued no matter what happens.
But it's important to note that pursuit does not mean the act of pursuing, but the motivation to pursue, because you can pursue inaction as an active mindset.
Okay, that is inaction, I-N-A-C-T-I-O-N, not inaction. So it is not acting, and not acting can be something one would pursue. Again, if you're trying to keep the shopping center from going in and disturbing the ecology of the wetlands, you might have someone who was pursuing inaction, trying to prevent that from happening, trying to prevent himself from being involved in it. Okay, so then we move on to our character in opposition to him, who is the antagonist. Okay, and what?
Go ahead. I'm just going to see what you're going to end up with.
I have no idea, because we've always had non-consideration as the antagonist. Have we made a mistake on the protagonist here?
No.
Okay. Then the antagonist has to be consideration in that particular structure. Okay. All right. Here's something that we want to clarify at this point. It's even difficult for us. The difficulty is in terms of looking at story structure as one entire mind set, a character will have a fixed aspect in this left-minded film in the mindset that he represents as being a characteristic that he illustrates from the outside view, from God's eye view, looking into this mindset. But that is not necessarily what he will be doing, because the sets are duplicated. All 64 elements that appear in the mindset also appear in the physical set. And if you fix the mindset, just say that's the one we're going to fix, and then explore the problem throughout the physical set, and then have to change our mindset in order to succeed. If that's the way that you go about it, then they will be representative, the characters will be representative in the fixed mindset of aspects of that mind, although that will not be necessarily any type of active doing of that characteristic. It will be there to represent that piece. Now, when we talk about the protagonist being pursued, we can see in many stories that are action-oriented that in the physical set that's floating, that is not fixed, he will pursue, and then he will support, and he will oppose, and he will avoid taking action. And this will be in response to the situation he encounters and what he's learned about it. But he's always the one who is moving towards resolution of the dilemma. He is the one who has the attitude to continue to move towards the resolution of the dilemma between the mental and the physical. Again, each individual character initially should not be seen as having his own mental and physical aspects inside. That is a lower level development that is important to round out the characters, but gets in the way of understanding their functionality and structure. We have to instead look at the character as having something they represent to the entire story as a mindset and a physical set. And the protagonist as pursuit in the mindset means that just from the external view, he doesn't see this himself. The other characters don't see this themselves. Only we as an audience or an author can see that he is the one who is inexorably driven to move to the point of decision about that dilemma. And so we describe him from our perspective as pursuit. Then, in terms of the action he can pursue or avoid or whatever he does in the mobile set, and that works very nicely in conjunction with it. They do not have to match up, and it's better if they don't for dramatic tension purposes. In that perspective, we look at the pursuing character in the mindset as non-consideration, so that he is actively not paying attention to the problem. We have taken the characteristic of not considering the problem and the characteristic of moving inexorably towards its solution and combined them in a single character called the protagonist.
And that is why that character gets into greater and greater internal conflict, because his attitudes are in exact opposition to each other. One is his attitude toward pursuing his solution, and yet he has also got the attitude of not considering the problem.
And this leads to him gathering more and more information that he's not employing. So essentially, he moves through all kinds of situations and interrelationships and learns about the nature of the problem by gathering information, but he refuses to employ it in his decision-making process, because pursuit does not require a decision. Pursuit is only an information-gathering foray. And as he goes out on that... Oh! Microcassette. All right, when we look at our antagonist, if someone is pursuing something, his direct opposite is in terms of characteristic, might be to avoid something, and yet that's not where the antagonist lies. And this is one of the unique things about our view, is that the antagonist is not directly opposite to the protagonist. He is in direct opposition to the protagonist. And that's intriguing. His characteristic of opposing the pursuit of the protagonist means that he will try to prevent the protagonist from advancing, essentially. That his attitude is, wherever the protagonist wants to go, the antagonist doesn't want him to get there. In terms of the mental set, it is the attitude of preventing one from gathering further information to help resolve the problem. So, whereas there is a characteristic of avoidance, which would be to run away from a problem, that's not what the antagonist does. The antagonist opposes the pursuit. And in that respect, he does match up in direct antithesis in terms of representing consideration. So whereas the protagonist is non-consideration, he is not looking at the nature of the problem. The antagonist is forcing consideration because of the nature of what he does, the nature of what he represents in the story. He is the thorn in the side of the mindset that requires the problem to be considered. So as long as the protagonist is not considering the problem, he will be forced to continue to pursue by the consideration aspect, by the antagonist. So in that methodology, eventually he will pursue to the point where he is forced to either, the protagonist is forced to either consider and solve the problem or not consider and avoid it. So the antagonist then is kind of skewed in reference to the protagonist. He is directly across him in terms of like characteristics. He is at consideration instead of the protagonist's non-consideration, but he is kind of sideways to him in terms of opposing the pursuit as opposed to being directly across in avoidance. And that is a very interesting dynamic that, again, is unique to the system we have. Who's next? Character. You want to do any of these? Or?
No.
No? Okay. Next we will do the character we call the Skeptic. Now the Skeptic is the one who embodies the avoid characteristic. And in that sense, he is the antithesis of the protagonist at that level. For whatever the protagonist wants to go after, the Skeptic wants to go away from. He is the one who is always trying to escape from the danger. He is the one who, at the first sign of trouble, will want to turn and run, in opposition to the protagonist, who is not affected by that. He just continues in his quest to achieve his solution to his problem. No matter what gets in his way, he's always pursuing. The Skeptic character on his second level is tied in with disbelief. And disbelief is the characteristic of being actively disbelieving, not just not convinced. He will actually come up with an attitude saying, this is not right, this is not correct, I don't see enough information here. And when you can combine that in the traditional way of getting the traditional skeptic, you have a character who runs away from danger and doesn't believe in their success, doesn't believe in their plans, doesn't believe in the abilities of the protagonist or anybody else.
No.
What?
You're mixing.
I am?
Yes. He does not believe that there is a problem. That's from this mindset. When you're looking at the fixed mindset.
From a mindset, he doesn't believe in anything.
Right. Disbelief in the problem. There is no problem.
Okay.
It's not the fact that I'm not going to look at the problem, which is non-consideration.
Mm-hmm.
It's disbelief in the problem. There is no problem.
I always
Avoidance.
looked at him as disbelief in the solution.
Well, that's fine. Disbelief in the solution, disbelief in the problem,
Mm-hmm.
it's disbelief in the mental mindset.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, when one is considering the physical problem, he will disbelieve any of those solutions too.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody suggests a solution of how to get out of something, he'll say, I don't believe that's not going to work. Or in his avoidance role, he could say, well, let's not even worry about that. Let's just get the hell out of here because, we shouldn't even be here, or we should let's get out of here. Or we're going to get killed or whatever.
Right.
So it's very easy to flop back and forth between looking at it as part of the mindset and looking at it as part of the physical set. The important aspect of it is that once you have decided which set you have frozen, just look at those and look at them in terms of the mental problem. If you have frozen the mental set, it's the mental problem. If you've frozen the physical set, it's the physical problem.
Right. The the interesting thing about that pairing is that he disbelieves the existence of the problem and tries to avoid it also, which is, again, an internal conflict. All of these characters have some sort of internal conflict going on, which is what gives them a potential as characters, which is why they are paired up the way they are.
And why you see them in lots of different stories, because that way, if they each have their own internal conflict, then they can move and be swayed and not move just in one direction, so they're not as predictable. If you take all of these 16 characteristics and put one per physical, body, then it will be very, very predictable as to how every single character is going to act in any particular situation. But by combining them, you don't know which of the traits are going to be, at that moment, going to be taken into consideration more than the other. So it makes them more interesting than very, very flat, one-sided characters.
Let me try an idea on you here while we're rolling, because I don't know if this is valid or not. But when we come to our primary character, ultimately, and we put a complete mindset and a complete physical set, and in the mindset, he represents certain characteristics, and other characters represent certain characteristics. In the physical set, the primary character will go through all of the characteristics act by act. But that's not necessarily true of the other characters in the physical set. And theoretically, which is one reason why I slipped into having the wrong perspective on that, is that it is not essential for the character of the skeptic to be anything other than disbelief in the physical set as well.
Right.
He could remain disbelief and be fixed. He does not have to be. What he has to be is fixed in disbelief of the mental issue, the problem, on the mindset. And he has to be in avoidance of the problem on the mindset and stay there all the way through consistently, or you don't have a fixed mindset. And in terms of the physical action, since he is not the primary character, he can or cannot remain there in terms of the physical set, depending on how the author chooses to explore those relationships. That's interesting. Okay, so then we move on to who?
The
Sidekick. Okay. Sidekick, in terms of mindset, is always made up of support and faith. Now, in terms of the pursuing and avoiding and opposing, he supports. In other words, he adds his energy and his attitude towards whatever the protagonist is trying to pursue. He is, in that respect, appears very, very loyal, and loyalty is a characteristic that is often mistaken for the sidekick when it is really support. He is fixed in the position, in the mindset of supporting the protagonist. That is intriguing because it does not require that he likes the protagonist. It does not require that he is in the protagonist's group. It doesn't require anything except that when the protagonist is trying to pursue something, whatever it is.
Well, again, when he's pursuing the consideration of the problem, or pursuing the solution of the problem,
right,
the sidekick will lend his support to the protagonist, so that the protagonist will then be better suited or better able to reach the end of the problem.
And this leads frequently to the sidekick being involved as a sounding board for the protagonist's musings about the nature of the problem. As he is thinking about the problem, as he is talking about the problem, He is discussing what he has learned so far by pursuing, and yet he's still not coming to a conclusion. He's still not in consideration. He's just enumerating the items. And in that enumeration, that effort to take stock of what has been learned is supplied frequently by the sidekick as support. In terms of faith in terms of believing that a problem exists mentally, and also faith that a solution can be found. That looks very similar to pursuit, but pursuit is the attitude to go after a solution, not necessarily the belief that one is really there. And so if one is pursuing, one is just saying, I am committed now to going after a solution, whether or not one exists. I'm going to take this course until it's proven to me that one exists or not, that one is found or not. I will keep looking for it. And the sidekick, on the other hand, represents faith that a solution can be found, faith that the problem really does exist, and he holds that faith throughout the story. Okay, we're going to move on now to the emotional character, who's a real intriguing one. The emotional character is the one who goes crazy at the drop of a hat because of his internal feelings about things. He just has his emotions incensed by something, and he is not organized about them. That's the typical representation of the emotional character. What he is really consisting of is feeling mixed with, what do we call it, uncontrolled? Okay, with uncontrol. Feeling being the emotive aspect of the mind, and uncontrol being not applying it to a solution or towards forward advancement, merely expressing it in all kinds of different directions. So it's a very unfocused characteristic. Essentially, the characteristic of uncontrolled is the defocusing aspect of the human mind. And when we have a specific direction that we might go, when we have a particular inequity that we're dealing with, if instead of taking a linear course to get there in one form or another, we just lash out in all directions because of our feeling about this inequity, we don't really get anywhere. We're counterproductive in terms of finding a solution. Instead, we're just dissipating energy that we feel there's an inequity here. And that is specifically the mindset of that emotional character. Anything on that? Okay. His counterpart would be the intellectual character, or reason, as we sometimes refer to him. And reason would be one that deals from a basis of logic and deals in a channeled or controlled manner. When he is dealing from logic, he is not involved in dealing from his emotions. He's only looking at the most efficient, efficacious approach to the problem, to the solution of the problem. He's thinking about its existence in terms of logic, not in terms of human feeling. And so everything to do with respect to the moral or mental problem, he will be thinking in terms of the nuts and bolts of how things are related, not their impact on how one may feel about them or about the problem. He will also be involved in a very organized fashion of laying out the data. And as things are learned about the nature of the problem in the mind, and even information that would lead one to believe that it exists or not, he is the one who patterns that information. He is the one who puts it into an ordered list, a chart, a graph. Essentially, when that question comes up about the moral issue, he will look at it logically and deal with it in an organized fashion to a specific purpose. Okay, then we end up with the Guardian character next. Good, we'll do him. Okay, Guardian in the simple story is made up of conscience and health. Now, in terms of conscience, that's got plenty of connotative value. He represents in the mind the sense of right and wrong, that this is what we should do. That not just that we know what is right and what is wrong, but the tendency to want to do what is right. what is right? Well, morality is a whole other discussion we'll get into later, and it could be the author's morality or the audience's or a specific character's morality or God's morality, depending on how many people agree on it. But in essence, it means that there is some external right or wrong that one believes exists, and our sense of it is our conscience, that we want to do the thing that we perceive as right, which frequently is not what is of immediate benefit to our specific selves, but is more of benefit either to others or in benefit in the long run. Combining that is the characteristic of help, where in terms of the mental problem, again, the mind problem, helping along the way is different than supporting. Supporting is lending one's attitude towards going after it. Helping is providing tools, and by helping, new things are added, essentially, that make the pursuit easier. Not just the motive force of supporting, but the actual tools necessary to pursue the solution. Tools are added by helping. Go for a second, I'm getting hoarse.
The last of the characters is the contagonist, and the contagonist represents hinder and disbelief. Disbelief in the, I'm sorry, not hinder, disbelief. Hinder and temptation. Better. Hinder in the sense that the contagonist will divert the protagonist's pursuit of the problem from its course away from the solution for the sake of diverting it from the solution, inasmuch as the guardian helps the protagonist get back on track. The contagonist hinders the pursuit of the problem. He also represents temptation. As temptation, it is an attitude methodology of hindering. In other words, he presents the easy way out instead of the correct way out. He represents the solution that the protagonist would like to take, but it is not the correct path to solve the problem.
So temptation essentially is the lure to get the pursuing character to give up the pursuit. And that it can manifest itself in many ways, but essentially it's just something that would say, you don't need to pursue, there's no reason to pursue. The arguments would be that it is in your self-interest not to pursue. And that essentially is the function of the tempter. Now, having gone through these very briefly, we have described those 8 very simple characters and the very simple combinations. One of the initial things we discovered about these was that certain traits could be swapped between some of these physical characters, and that we could take, for example, the character of the guardian and the contagonist, and have the guardian still be conscience and the contagonist still be temptation, but have the guardian instead be hinder instead of help, and have the temptation character be help instead of hinder. The reason one would do this is if the pursuing character is pursuing an improper solution, that they are going after something that they should not go after from the external moral viewpoint of the author, that it would then be conscience's job to hinder the pursuit of that improper mental attitude. That essentially a solution to the mindset requires a changing of the mind. And when you have a fixed mindset, if that's the proper set to have, according to the author, if he says that if you maintain this particular attitude that is proper, at least within this situation of this story, then the last thing that should be accomplished in terms of conscience, looking at the problem, is that the pursuing character would continue to pursue that different mindset, to give up his attitude. In order to accomplish that, he will then hinder the pursuit of that solution. And the tempting character looking for what would be the easy path, which in this particular scenario would be changing one's mind and giving up one's adamance about a particular attitude, that might be easier than facing opposition in terms of that attitude. Well, then the easy thing to do is giving it up, and rather than the easy thing to do is